Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Shabbos Daf Kuf Mem discusses a number of different areas of food preparation and a lot of potential different isurim which one might encounter while trying to do them. The Gemara will go through them one by one and give the halachos and the opinions regarding each one. Then we get to a Mishnah which continues that discussion. The Gemara will interrupt with a long list of disparate pieces of advice for Talmid Chachamim. Then we get to another Mishnah and we continue discussing presenting food, but this time it is for animals. So first of all, we had seen that you're allowed to strain an egg through a mustard strainer. The Gemara says the reason is because the yolk is only being removed to color the mustard seed that's on the bottom. It's not that you want it not the other. If that was the case, then it would be borer, but it's not borer because you plan to use just the coloring aspect of it. Now the Gemara discusses preparing mustard itself. So the mustard is a seed, and you have a large collection of it. It is a powder. They're very small seeds, but they clump together if you add liquid before Shabbos. Now, if you were to add liquid on Shabbos, it's a question of lush because it becomes combined into one, and also mixing it together combines it into one mass. And that would also be an issue of lush. So what does the Gemara say you're allowed to do? If you have the liquid added before Shabbos, you may add more liquid on Shabbos, but you should not mix it, not the way you usually do. How could you? So there's four opinions here. Rav says by hand, by a kli, but not by hand. Shmuel says that wouldn't make sense because the normal way to do it is with a kli. By hand is what you would do for food for a chamor, for a donkey. So he says you should mix it with your hand and not with a kli. Rav Elazar says you're not allowed to do either, and Rav Yochanan says you're allowed to do both. Abaye and Rav said the halacha does not follow Rav Yochanan, but then Rav Yochanan changed his opinion and he holds now like Rav Elazar that you're not allowed to do either, and then Abaye and Rav say that the halacha is like Rav Yochanan, but Rav Elazar himself abandoned this position and went to hold like Shmuel that you're allowed to do it with a hand and not a kli. Okay, now the Gemara has a list of several Amoraim who are machmir, stringent on this issue. Abaye's mother, who's his adoptive mother, mixed liquid into his mustard on Shabbos and he did not want to eat it. Rav Zeira's wife, who was Rav Zeira was the Rebbe of Rav Chia Bar Ashi, and his wife made food for him, and she mixed liquid into it on Shabbos and he didn't want to eat it, and she said, I used to make this for your Rebbe Zeira, my husband, and he ate it. How come you don't want to eat it? Rav Bar Shaba says, I was once standing before Ravina and I mixed for him mustard with a stalk of garlic and he ate it. And Mazutra says, halacha is not like any of these things. The halacha is that if the mustard was mixed with liquid before Shabbos, you're allowed to add more liquid and mix it both by hand and with a kli on Shabbos. You also add honey, but you should be careful. You should only mix it lightly. You should not beat it. Similar to that, if you have chachalayim, which is karshinin, which is a type of chopped grain. So if it's chopped before Shabbos, then you're allowed to add oil and vinegar and mint, and you can mix it but not beat it. If you have garlic, which is ground before Shabbos, you're allowed to add beans and split beans, but you be careful to mix lightly and again not to beat it all together. Now we just defined, we had said amisa is mint. The Gemara defines that, and now the Gemara says, you see from here that mint is good for karshinin. It's a good recipe. Okay. Now the Gemara goes back to Mishnah. The Mishnah we had seen that you're allowed to make inamlin. The Gemara says, what are these things? Inamlin is a mixture of wine, honey, and pepper, which you're allowed to make aluntis, which is a mixture of old wine, clear water, and afar simon. What's that used for? That's used for somebody who goes to the bathhouse, is very hot. This will cool him inside. Rav Yosef says, I once followed Mar Ukva into the bathhouse, and when he came out, he gave me a cup of this stuff to drink, and I felt it's cooling from my hair down to the toenails. If he had given me a second cup, then I would have lost some of my schar and olam haba. There's a dispute if that means that it was so pleasurable that he would have lost schar, or if it would have been so cooling that it would have brought him to a dangerous situation, and he would have lost schar and olam haba in order to save him from suffering ill effects. Something we're asked about, Mar Ukva drinks this every day, so how could there be such a effect? And the Gemara says, Mar Ukva is different. Since you drank it so often, there was no problem. Okay, now we begin our next Mishnah. The Mishnah again discusses a number of different things you can do in food preparation. First of all, we talk about chiltas. Chiltas is what forms the Temani dip called chilbeh. It's in English it's called asofatida. So the Mishnah says you're allowed to soak it in warm water. You're not allowed to soak it in warm water. You are allowed to dip it in vinegar. That means to mix it with vinegar and use it as a dip for your bread. Now, if you have karshinin, which is kind of like oatmeal, it's the oats for the meal. So you're not allowed to mix it with water so that the chaff, the husks, float off, and you're not allowed to rub them. But you are allowed to put them in a sieve or in a sifter, a basket, and even though you may be sifting it along the way, but that's not your intent, and therefore it's okay. As far as straw, which you want to feed to your animals, so you're allowed to scoop it out with a sieve, even though the chaff, the ends, the rough ends will fall through. That's okay, because again, it's Eina Miskaven, it's not what you intend to do, but to actually sift it directly, that you're not allowed to do. That would be sifting boer on Shabbos. Okay. Going to the Gemara. Asafetida chiltis chilba, we said that you're not allowed to soak it in warm water. The Gemara says if you do, what happens? Machlokas between Rav Ada Narsha, who says that it's a daraisa, chayv chatus, and Abaye says that it can't be chayv chatus, it's only uvda d'chol, it's only a weekday activity. Think about it, if you soak in meat in water, would that be usher? The Gemara is not saying those are comparable, it's just an expression. So that's not a problem. So this is also not a real issue. It's only uvda d'chol, which is an isser derabanan. Okay, now the Gemara asks Rav Yochanan, asks Rav Yanai, what about soaking in cold water? So the Gemara says, he said that it's usher. So he said, what do you mean? But the Mishnah said the problem is only warm water. So he answered, listen, if I can't explain this Mishnah, then I'm no better than you. And it was known that Rav Yanai was on a higher level in learning than Rav Yochanan. So he's saying that it's as follows. There's a brisa which clarifies this. It's actually a machlokes, and this Mishnah is the opinion of Rav Yosi. The brisa says that Rav Yosi and the Chachamim both agree that you're not allowed to soak in warm water. The machlokes is, are you allowed to soak in cold water? And that was what he had asked. You're allowed to soak in cold water. On that, the Tanna Kama says the Chachamim say it's forbidden. And Rav Yosi says that it's permitted. Our Mishnah goes like Rav Yosi that it's permitted. However, the halacha is like the Tanna Kama, the Chachamim, that it's forbidden, and therefore it's no good. Now the Gemara says, what is this mixture for? This asafetida soaked in the water. What is that about? The Gemara says it's for a condition called heavy heart. The Gemara says Rav Acha bar Yosef had this, and he came to Mar Ukva, and Mar Ukva said, what you should do is you should drink 3 gold dinars weight of this mixture over the next 3 days. Now, the first day was Thursday. He drank it Thursday, he drank it Friday, and then came Shabbos. So he went to the Beis Medrash to ask, what am I supposed to do? So they told him, you're allowed to drink it. It's not a problem. You can drink a kav, 2 kavs. It's not a problem. It's not an isser. It's not a question of medicine on Shabbos because healthy people also drink this thing. So he said, I wasn't worried about that. I was worried about making it. Am I allowed to soak it? I know you are not supposed to soak it on Shabbos, but is it forbidden to me also because I'm in the middle of a course of medication? The Gemara says, Bar Avin said to Rav Acha bar Yosef, I had a similar situation. I asked Rav Ada bar Ava. He didn't know the halacha, and then I asked Rav Huna, and he told me that Rav said that you're allowed to do it, and since you need it to be warm, leave it out in the sun to become warm, because you're allowed to soak it in cold water, but you're not allowed to soak this chiltis in hot water. Now the Gemara says that you're saying you're allowed to soak it in cold water. That means it's only according to the Chachamim, that's only according to Rav Yosi, but not according to the Chachamim. So you're not even allowed to soak it in cold water, like we saw earlier. The Gemara says no, even according to the Chachamim it should be okay, but since you already started it, taking it before Shabbos, if you were to stop now, it would cause a dangerous situation, and therefore you're allowed to. Okay, now on the subject of things that Rav Acha bar Yosef said, the Gemara has another story here. Rav Acha bar Yosef was walking, and he was leaning on the shoulder of his nephew, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, because he was old and he had a hard time at walking, and he said, listen, when we pass the house of Rav Safra, bring me in over there. So he did so, and he asked Rav Safra, if you have a clean, freshly washed cotton shirt, are you allowed to rub it on Shabbos? Now, there are 2 things that accomplish if you do that. First of all, you soften the fabric because the washing makes it stiff, and second of all, it becomes whiter and brighter. So whiter and brighter would be aser because that's adding to the cleaning. You're not allowed to clean on Shabbos. But if the issue is just for the softening, then you're allowed to. So Rav Safra said you're allowed to. All you want to do is soften the shirt. Anything else is Eina Miskaven. You don't need to worry about it. So when he came out, so his nephew said, what do you ask? So he said, I asked about rubbing a cotton shirt. So he said, why do you ask about a shirt? Why don't you ask about a handkerchief? That's a more common thing. So he said, no, handkerchief, I didn't need to ask because I already asked Rav Huna that, and he told me that that's usher. There, it's certainly to whiten it. My question was about the shirt, where you might be just rubbing it to soften it. So Gemara says, why don't you learn from the handkerchief to the shirt? And he said, yeah, because the handkerchief is for sure the whitening, but here it might be just the softening. Okay, on the subject of laundering, the Gemara says, or Chizda said, any freshly laundered shirt is spread out on a stick, slipped through the sleeve so that it stretches out to dry. So you're allowed to take the shirt off the stick, but don't take the stick out of the shirt because the stick is muktzah. Unless it's a stick that a weaver uses to weave, that's not muktzah, that's a kli, and that is permitted. On the same subject, Rav Chizda, or not the same subject, but by Rav Chizda, we also saw that if you have a bunch of herbs, so you're allowed to move them. They're not muktzah if an animal would eat them, if it's animal food. Otherwise, it's muktzah, you're not allowed to. Same thing applies to a rope where you have meat hanging and drying. That is mutter because you could eat the meat even though it's raw. It's technically edible, but raw fish is not edible, and therefore the raw fish is going to be muktzah. Okay, now the Gemara discusses a list of pieces of advice which are brought by Rav Chizda in the name of Katina, which is who we had quoted earlier. And they are all aimed at Talmidei Chachamim, but several Mefarshim here understand this as all being Meshalim. It's all an allegory to something else. But we'll just learn the simple shot that we see here. First of all, it says that somebody who stands in the middle of the bed of a married couple is if he's standing on the stomach of the woman itself, meaning to say that he's placing himself in a situation where he's going to inspire impure thoughts. The Gemara disagrees here. It's with Katina himself who says this is actually not a problem. I don't see an issue with that. Okay, next, if you buy a bunch of vegetables, buy long vegetables because then you get more for your money because the vegetables are all tied with the same string and therefore they're the same thickness. But if you have longer, so that adds to the amount that you get without increasing the price. Same thing applies to reeds. If you buy reeds, the same thing. Next, a Torah scholar who doesn't have too much bread. So you should be careful not to eat too many vegetables because that'll make you hungry. This is only raw vegetables, not cooked. And you won't have bread to satisfy your hunger. Rav Chizda says, when I was poor, I didn't eat raw vegetables. And when I was, because of this reason I was rich, I didn't eat them either because then I could afford meat and fish, and that's better for you. It's more healthy, and therefore I ate the meat and the fish instead. On the subject of a poor Talmid Chacham, you should be careful not to cut up his bread into too many small pieces and eat them separately. Rather, you should wait until he has enough for a satisfying meal, and then you should eat it like that. Now, the halach is that the Talmid Chacham is the one who's supposed to break bread and say hamaitzi and give it out to everybody. So the Gemara says that if he's poor, he shouldn't be the one to do it because he's supposed to give out ba'ayin yafa generously, and he's not going to do it ba'ayin yafa. Rav Chizda actually adds, when I was poor, I did not give out the bread unless I was sure that there was enough for me that I wouldn't feel hungry and I wouldn't be concerned about how much I'm giving out. Okay, on the subject of Chizda says somebody who could eat barley bread instead eats wheat bread is wasting his money. It's baltashches. He should have just eaten the barley bread. Of course, it's assuming that he is watching his expenses. Rav Papa says the same applies to somebody who could drink beer instead drinks wine. It's also baltashches, you're wasting your money. The Gemara disagrees with this. The Gemara says no, it's healthier for you to eat wheat bread and wine, and therefore it's baltashches of the body to avoid eating it. Rav Chizda says that in the old days they used to wash their hands with oil after a meal. So if you don't have that, then you should use the juice that's found inside the pits of fruits. Rav Chizda says that a Talmid Chacham who is poor and needs to buy meat should only buy the neck meat because you have 3 different types of meat in the neck meat, and therefore he has a broader range for his money. Okay, Rav Chizda now turns to advice for a Talmid Chacham to have nice clothing because he's responsible to appear well dressed for the honor of Torah. So it says he should buy a cotton shirt from the area of Nahar Abba, and he should clean it every 30 days. That way it'll last for a full year. Don't clean it more often than that because then it won't last. And I personally guarantee it. Rav Chizda says, by the way, what is the root of the word kitunisa, which is cotton? So he says it's kita na, meaning a good group. You should be. It should show that you are part of a good group of Talmidei Chachamim. Next, it says that he should not sit on a mat made out of tipsa, which is hemp, because it's moist and therefore will ruin the clothing that he sits with. He should also not send his clothing to be cleaned by the woman who runs the hotel or the house that he's staying in, because he may find stains on it, and then that will make him and all Talmidei Chachamim disgusting to her. Okay, now Rav Chizda gave a number of pieces of advice to his daughters for their behavior with their husbands. First of all, he said you should be modest, so as not to make him repulsed. You should not eat bread in your husband's presence, because you might eat too much and then he'll be disgusted. You should not eat vegetables at night, that'll affect your breath. You should not eat dates at night. That'll cause other odors. You should not drink beer at night. That'll cause other relieving yourself issues. You should not use the bathroom in the same place that your husband relieves himself, and certainly not in front of him. Now, separately than that, you should be careful not to be used to referring to men or speaking to men, and therefore if somebody knocks at the door, instead of saying Manu, who is there in the male form, say Mani, who is there in the female form. Don't get used to speaking to men in the male form. Okay, now some instructions for how to behave during intimate moments. Rav Chizda refers to the upper area of the woman as the pearl and the lower area as the oven. And he says as follows: when your husband is trying to arouse you, he will hold the pearl in one hand and the oven in the other hand. You should, however, offer him the pearl and not the oven, so that he will become tormented, and then when you have really created desire within him, only then should you offer the oven. Okay, now we go back to the Mishnah. In the Mishnah it said that you are allowed to, that you should not put karshinin, that's a type of sliced grain used for oatmeal. You should not put them into a place to float, but you are allowed to put them in a sieve or a basket and allow the chaff to fall out, whereas that does not fit with Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, who says that you're not allowed to use a sieve under any circumstances, so our Mishnah disagrees. Okay, now we get to the next Mishnah. The Mishnah discusses moving animal food, and it teaches us three halachos. First of all, if you want to sweep out the trough of an ox that you're trying to fatten up and you want him to eat well, so you want the trough to be clean, are you allowed to sweep out the dirt that's in it beforehand? Rabbi Daisa says you are allowed to. What about the food and the straw that's fallen on the floor of the stall? You're allowed to move that to the side so that he shouldn't trample on it and get it filthy with excrement. Then it says the Chachamim say that it's aser, and the Gemara will explain which of these two they argue on. And the third halacha is that you're allowed to take food from one animal and give it to another animal. So the Gemara asks which halacha do the Chachamim argue on, the first, the second, or both. And the Gemara quotes a brisa. It says that the Chachamim argue on both, and so you're not allowed to do either of them. So what's the reason? Why can't you sweep out the trough? So the Gemara first says, Rav Chizda says, because we're afraid that if the trough's floor is made out of earth, you'll end up smoothing the earth. You're not allowed to sweep earth on Shabbos because you'll be smoothing the floor. The Gemara says, but that's an issue right, so there can't be anybody who says that that's permitted. So the Gemara says, no, the issue is where it's not an earthen floor, it's a metal floor, but we're afraid if we allow you to do that, you'll end up doing the earthen floor. That's the machlokas, you do that or not. Now the Gemara doesn't explain, but the issue with the second thing, moving the straw to the side, is that there may be some ruined food in there already, and that'll be muktzah, and therefore you shouldn't be allowed to move it. Now you're allowed to take from one animal to another, so the Gemara has two brises. One says you're allowed to take from an animal with a good mouth to give it to an animal with a bad mouth, and one says an animal with a bad mouth, you're allowed to give it to an animal with a good mouth. So Abai explains, both of these are saying you're allowed to take food from the donkey and give it to the ox. Just one of them refers to the donkey as the good mouth and the other as the bad mouth, and the other vice versa. How so? Because in different aspects, the donkey has a better mouth or worse mouth than the ox. How so? The donkey doesn't drool, so his saliva doesn't get into the food. So in that sense, he has a good mouth and the ox has a bad mouth. However, the donkey has a bad mouth because he'll eat anything. He'll eat thorns and all kinds of sticks and other things that are in there, and the ox doesn't do that. But still, either way, you're allowed to take the donkey food to the ox, but not vice versa.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.